Ben from Huckabuy again, and today we're going to be discussing dynamic rendering. There's a couple things that we're going to be covering this. First off, what is it, why you need it, and the difficulties and the ease that it can happen when wanting to install it on your website. So first off, what is dynamic rendering? Well, before we get into actually what dynamic rendering is, you kind of have to understand how the Google bots work. So Google has a flat HTML bot, and what happens is anytime they crawl your site, that HTML bot goes to your site. Well, most every single site right now has something called JavaScript. JavaScript is widely used. So if you have, say, like a chat bot on your website, that chat bot actually interferes with that HTML bot or that Google bot that crawls your website. So when it interferes with that and it really slows down the crawl of your website, then Google switches to what they call a rendering bot, and that can actually see all the JavaScript. Now, the problem with that is we get into something called a crawl budget. And that crawl budget is that allotted time that Googlebot has for each website, because if they just diverted all of their time to crawl your entire website, every little bit of content, they wouldn't be able to crawl the billions of websites that are out there. So that being said, what's the best crawl experience that Google is wanting? That's why back in 2018, they're like, okay, dynamic rendering is just that. So dynamic rendering is the process of serving content based on the user agent that calls it. So in this instance, we're just referring to like Google bots or search bots. So when that HTML bot gets interfered with by, say, JavaScript or something on that, dynamic rendering, what that does is it converts a different version, or it converts a version of your website into flat HTML. So it even takes that JavaScript on your website and says, okay, Google. So if you think about it this way, Google loves Wikipedia pages. Those are just flat HTML with links and everything. So even though the user sees one version of the website, which is simply just what you see on a mobile device or a computer screen, the Google bot comes in and sees nothing but flat HTML. It can scan it extremely quickly. It doesn't have to switch to that rendering bot. So Google likes that a lot more. And in turn, the crawl budget, you're giving more resources to that crawl budget, and Google will give a deeper, more in-depth crawl of your website because you're not using up all of that crawl budget and it has to leave your site and might miss some important things. So why does that matter for marketers? Well, you want your content to be highly visible so that your target audience can find it while they're scrolling the internet. But if you have a larger website with a lot of dynamic and JavaScript driven content, search engines have a really difficult time crawling and indexing your site simply because you're using up that entire crawl budget. So when you use dynamic rendering, you're effectively translating your website into a language that not only do the Google bots or search bots know, but they actually prefer. So when should you use it? Let's take an example of what Google actually says. They recommend that webmasters incorporate dynamic rendering in at least 3 instances. So the first is recommended if you have a large site with rapidly changing content that requires really fast or really quick indexing. Second, it is recommended if your website relies on primarily JavaScript functionality. Third, it's also recommended if your website relies on social media sharing and chat applications that require a lot of top page content. So is it right for your website as dynamic rendering, or is dynamic rendering right for your website? Well, there's a couple things that you need to take into consideration. So some questions that you need to ask yourself. Is your website indexable? Does your website use JavaScript for some or all of your content? Does your content change frequently? Are you having crawl budget problems? And you can see those crawl budgets in Google Search Console, and it'll show really high crawl times, less information downloaded, and that's in the old legacy crawl reports. Are you limited in the resources that you can have? Like if you're a small company or the team that you have working on SEO or development, did they have the time and resource that it would take to implement the server-side rendering? So if you answer any yes to any of those questions, you should probably really think about dynamic rendering. Another thing to note on this is that historically JavaScript-powered websites, they haven't done well in search. They're user-friendly, but they're not bot-friendly, and it's solely attributed to the amount of crawl budget that Google has. Remember in the first part of the video, when if the HTML bot hits it and it encounters JavaScript, it has to go to that rendering bot, and that just takes a long time. Implementing dynamic rendering on your own, it's difficult, it's time-consuming, it's really resource-intensive. So even a competent and experienced team of developers is required to set up a set of system checks that identify every agent visiting that site or every bot visiting that site to determine which type of content to serve. So it's a really, really, really cumbersome process. Fortunately, Huckabuy, our cloud software and dynamic rendering, it takes care of that entire process for your business website. So you can really, really understand the impacts of what this does for SEO. And yes, we've talked about the crawl budget. When you have flat HTML and Google can actually crawl that more in depth and more efficiently, what we're noticing, and this isn't confirmed yet, we're just starting to notice this trend, is that after a certain period of time, Google actually increases your crawl budget. That's a signal from them that they really, really like your website and the way that their bots are seeing it. So one other thing to keep in mind is that dynamic rendering is not considered cloaking. If you think about it like a classic bait and switch, a website might serve a page to the search bot about cats, but the user sees content that is fundamentally different. For example, content about dogs instead. Google takes issue with those types of cases and penalizes them accordingly. Dynamic rendering is entirely different because you're serving the same content, it's just in flat HTML as opposed to something that may be very JavaScript heavy. So Huckabuy's perspective on this is it's a pretty simple concept. Pages load dynamically based on what calls them. For example, if you go to your URL on your mobile phone, you'll get an experience. And if you go to the same URL on your desktop, you'll get a different experience. So a site will be dynamically rendered to best fit the object user / bot that is calling that specific site. So Google made a huge change when they announced that you could provide an optimized version of your website just for them. So why did they do that? Well, as JavaScript has taken off across the internet, Google's job of crawling and indexing has become very difficult, and it requires a lot of money, requires a lot of time and resources. And because almost every page on the internet now has JavaScript, Google's rendering costs just became way too high. So they started asking webmasters to serve up a separate version of this content, especially a separate version or one specifically designed for their Googlebot without JavaScript. So that's where the Huckabuy Cloud dynamic rendering software comes in. It's that solution that takes a complicated website with a lot of JavaScript, converts it into flat HTML, serves it to the Googlebot, and in a way that it can read and fully understand. So including that, so if Google's perfect world was flat HTML sites with structured data and super fast page speed, guess what? Huckabuy has all of those. So if you queue that up with that slew of software, think about it this way. Our CEO, Jeff Atkinson, said, unsurprisingly, if you give Google what they want, they'll send you a lot of traffic. Thank you guys for watching. I hope this explains dynamic rendering well, and we will talk to you soon.